So I just got some photos back from being developed. Here are the negatives. I have not seen these yet, and I'm really excited, and I'm also really nervous because I don't know if they came out, how they came out, but these are my photos from the 2024 solar eclipse. So I thought it'd be fun to look at them for the first time in this video and also go through the process of scanning them and converting them with FilmLab and seeing what kind of results we get. So before we look at these negatives, let me tell you about what I was trying to accomplish, what I hope we're going to find when we scan this film. When we heard about the solar eclipse coming, and that it was going to be visible, we'll be able to see the totality just a few hours drive from where we live here in southern Maine. I started thinking about how to shoot it on film. And as I looked around at other eclipse photographs, one of the ones that I thought was interesting, or one of the approaches that I thought was interesting, was shooting a time lapse where you get to see all the phases of the eclipse in one photo. And these days, most people create those digitally, but I found a few examples of time lapses shot on film, and I thought that was really cool. And so I started kind of sketching in my notebook ideas for the eclipse. And so here would be kind of a classic time lapse where you've got some kind of foreground and then the different phases. But the other idea that I got excited about was the idea of shooting the eclipse on a half-frame camera as a sequence of images. One of the characteristics of film, when you're shooting in 35mm or another roll format, is that you have this sequence of frames and you know that they take place over time. The later frames had to be taken after the earlier frames on the roll of film. And so it kind of made me think about a storyboard in a movie or a comic strip. And there's this book, Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, which is one of my favorite books ever about the creative process. And he's talking about comics as being sequential art. So there's a big difference between just having one picture and having two pictures in a row. The two or more show the passage of time, or it can even be cause and effect. And it's funny, one of the examples in his book is even the sun moving in the sky. So it got me thinking about the half frame format. Half frame is half of a 35mm frame. So you get a bunch of images that are portrait in orientation. And it kind of lends itself to more of a comic book type format because the frames are narrower. You can stack more of them next to each other and kind of juxtapose one after the other. And there's a lot of history of people purposefully using half-frame cameras to shoot a diptych or a triptych so they could have a sequence of images that would go together. So I decided it would be cool to shoot the eclipse on a strip of film on a half-frame camera in a way that showed the progression of the eclipse happening. These are some of the sketches that I did as I was planning it out. In my notebook here, I kind of thought about what phases to try to capture and what would look good. And in the end, I decided to go for this one sequence of 5 images leading up to totality, and then another sequence of 5 images coming away from totality. And you could maybe even present it in this format with 10 of them stacked up, one on top of the other. And then the other idea I had was to do some side-by-side diptychs where it would show a person looking at the eclipse, and then it would show what they were seeing close up of the eclipse through a long lens. I have a little sketch here that I did in my iPad of the concept. So with that idea in mind, I got together some gear ahead of time for the eclipse. The cameras that I was going to shoot with, the primary camera that I was going to shoot with is this one, the Olympus Pen F. It's a half-frame camera. You can see the size of the shutter opening there. And the really cool thing about this camera is that it has interchangeable lenses. A lot of the half-frame cameras have a fixed lens, which is great for most things, but in this case, I wanted to get a really long lens and be able to attach it to get a close-up of the sun during the eclipse. So here is the lens I got. This is not an expensive or fancy lens, but I figured it would be good enough for my purposes. The cool thing about this, it's a 650 to 1300 millimeter lens, and it has a T-mount, which is a telescope mount, which you can get different adapters for. And as it turned out, there's an adapter available, the Olympus TA12, to connect this lens to the Pen-F. So I took some test shots ahead of time, figured out kind of what I wanted to do. And on the day of the eclipse, brought some film. I went with Ilford HP5. I thought about doing color, but I decided that overall black and white would be fine. And I kind of liked the vision I had for black and white. Having actually seen the eclipse, there's some cool, colorful things that happened during totality, which if I was doing it again, maybe I would shoot it on color film. But I decided to go with black and white. And I went with HP5 because it has a reputation for having a lot of exposure latitude. You can underexpose a little bit, you can overexpose by a lot, and your photos are going to still be usable. On the day of the eclipse, we drove up to Rangeley, my family and some friends. We got to watch the eclipse, which was awesome. And I had everything in my notebook planned out as far as the shots I was going to get, what my shutter speed was going to be, how I was going to frame it up. And I think it went well. I know there's a couple things that went wrong. One is I actually underexposed my photos by a stop on the roll of film where I was shooting the sequence of the eclipse. And I only realized it a couple photos in, and at that point, I didn't want to change it because I wanted them all to look the same. So fortunately, there's a fix when you underexpose your film, which is that you can push it in development. And I had them push it a stop, and it says here, BW push one stop. So they did do that at the lab. So hopefully that's okay. And then the other thing that happened is I did mess up one frame. I know that. I actually have two Pen-F bodies. I got a second one for this project. So one of the bodies was dedicated to just shooting the sequence. I had that mounted on the long lens, which was on a tripod. And then the other one I was going to use for these diptychs of people watching the eclipse and then pictures of the eclipse. So for that, I would take a picture of someone viewing the eclipse with the normal lens. And then I would take that lens off and attach it to the tripod. And I was trying to be careful doing that, switching bodies back and forth, but there was one moment where as I took my sequence camera off the tripod, I accidentally pressed the button. So I got a blank exposure in there. So my sequence isn't going to be perfect, but I think at least the first half of it is going to come out good. So that being the case, let's take a look at these negatives. I'm super nervous. This is going to be mostly blank because I only shot the beginning of it. Haha. Oh, look at that. There they are. That is really exciting. So there's a few photos from earlier in the day. And then here's my sequence. You can see going into totality. These aren't all perfectly centered, and that's expected because I was just manually moving my lens as the sun is moving in the sky. So I had to readjust it for every shot. And I knew this wasn't going to be like the world's most perfect photo of the eclipse. And there's plenty of really excellent, perfectly framed digital photos of the eclipse. But I was okay with having this have a little bit of an imperfect feel. But man, look at that. When I grab, this is my loop. It's just an old enlarging lens. And that looks sharp. Oh, wow. You can even see in the totality the little areas of sunspots around the edge. Cool. So there's my blank frame. That's where I messed up. If it wasn't for that, I would have had a really perfect sequence, but that's okay. You can't have perfection. You can see there's a little bit of like bleeding or flare around the edge. I think that's normal. I saw the same thing in a lot of digital photos, and it seems like depending on the exposure, when you process it, you can kind of hide that. It also could have been some flare because of the solar filter. I had a homemade solar filter that I made out of cardboard that I put over the end of the lens. But man, that's cool. I think something like that is going to be the sequence that I'm going to use. Oops, I turned off my backlight. Well, that is a huge relief just to know everything came out. There wasn't any major light leaks. That's awesome. I'm excited to scan this film. Let's look at the other one. This is the same deal. It's going to be mostly blank. And there it is. Cool. I played with exposure a little bit on this. I didn't do these all at the same exposure when I was shooting the Eclipse because I thought, you know, if my sequence is, the exposure is wrong on my sequence, at least maybe one of these will come out right. So I actually wasn't going to shoot the diamond ring at all. As I was planning out my sequence showing the different phases of the eclipse, I just thought that moment of the diamond ring sounds like it's so fleeting, it's in between the rest of the eclipse and totality. And I just didn't want to take the risk that I wouldn't get it and mess up my sequence. And I also wasn't sure what the exposure was going to be, what exposure settings would be right for that. But as that moment got closer, it was very exciting and adrenaline was flowing. And my friend was like, hey, you should take a picture with the diamond ring. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to go for it. So I tried using the second body to get the diamond ring, but I was definitely rushing. I didn't get a chance to frame it up because it had moved in the sky. The sun had moved and I didn't get to center it. I'm glad I got it. I wish I'd gotten it in the center. That would have been cool, but even as it is, it's still pretty cool. So at this point, I feel really happy. You know, there's always like mixed feelings when you look at your negatives or when you first look at your photos, because you have this vision of like what the perfect version would be. And then, at least for me, the reality usually has some imperfections in it. So I can look at this and I can say, well, it could have been better, but overall it also could have been like way worse, including having the film not come out at all. So I'm really happy based on looking at the negatives so far. It looks like we're going to have some usable images. So I'm just going to take a moment, feel my feelings of relief about that these negatives did come out, and then we'll go ahead and start scanning the film. So I've been thinking about how to scan this film, and I actually have a tool that's designed for scanning half frame film with full borders. It's this, the Negative Supply Basic Film Carrier Mark II. This film carrier has replaceable masks, and I have the mask right here for half frame. So if I was just scanning one frame at a time, I could put that on, and then when I did my scan, it would line up with one of my frames, and that would be good. Except in this case, I don't want to just scan one frame at a time. I want to scan a whole series as one scan. So the next option would be switching out the mask, and I have Negative Supply's panoramic mask, which fits in there. And that, if I switch back to my sequence, almost gives me what I want, but not quite. I can't quite get all the frames in there. But that's okay, because I actually don't want to use a film carrier at all for this particular scan. And the reason for that is that any film carrier is going to hold on to a little tiny bit of the film edge. Even a full border scan is cropping off a little bit of the edge because that's what's keeping the film flat. In this case, I really want to get the entire film, including all the way to the edge, because I want the scan to look like a piece of film. I want you to look at it and see that's a complete, unaltered piece of film. So what I'm going to do instead of using a film carrier, I need some way to keep my film flat. And I have something to do that, which are these, the negative supply micro-etched acrylic sheets. These are very similar to anti-Newton ring or ANR glass. It's a piece of glass, or in this case acrylic, that has been very slightly etched on one side, so it's matte. And you put the matte side against your film and you won't get Newton's rings, which is like a visual effect you get when film is sitting directly on top of perfectly smooth glass. So I've got 2 of these pieces of acrylic. I'm going to make a sandwich with the film in the middle. It'll be virtually transparent. They shouldn't take away from the optical quality of the scan. And I'm just going to sandwich it like this. One in the bottom, film in the middle, not on top. Of course, it won't be inside this protective sleeve anymore. And then for my scan, what I'm actually going to do is take multiple images and stitch them together, because I want this to be a nice high resolution scan. If I took only one picture, I'd have to crop it a lot to get rid of the top and bottom areas, but instead I'm going to get it nice and tight on the film and take multiple shots and stitch them together. So I'm going to go do the scanning. I'll come back and we'll start processing the scans. All right, so scanning's done. Now let's take a look at the files and see what we got. Here we've got all the raw files copied over to my computer. I'm going to open with FilmLab. And first thing I'll do is select all and say process as black and white negative. Cool. There they are. Now some of these are going to get stitched later, but I just got to go in and take a peek. That looks cool. The vision that I have for this, I want to leave the sprocket holes visible, so as I process, I'm going to make sure I don't totally get rid of those. I just copied and pasted my settings. Look at that. Oh, whoops, these are all backwards. Let me select all, flip. Now these are in order. And I can also just copy and paste settings right from here. We got it. I love these ones with being able to see, is it the corona we call it? The energy coming out from the sun. Looks super cool. And let's just look at a couple of these diptychs. Here's one. These are going to be a little more challenging because I was just using Sunny 16 to guess the exposure. So it may be that the right exposure settings for the picture is not the right exposure settings for the close-up of the Eclipse, but that's actually pretty good. Let's just get a see how that would look if I was doing that one as a 2x. There it is. That's pretty cool to see it come to life. And then here's the one. Oh man, that Ring of Fire, as I mentioned, was kind of a spur of the moment thing, and I hadn't taken the time to get it all perfectly lined up ahead of time, so I was moving fast. I just didn't quite get it. All right, so I'll go back and edit more of these later. Figure out the right contrast and density settings there. But for now, I'm going to show stitching. For stitching, there's a program called PTGui. I think that's how you say it. Yeah, it's an image stitcher. So let me go figure out all the ones I want for my sequence here. So these 3 are the ones I want. And I'm using a 105mm lens. I'm going to flip these So they're lined up correctly. Now let's see what happens when I press Align Images. Sometimes image stitching programs like this get confused when you're trying to stitch film because there's a lot of repeating elements like the sprocket holes and a lot of the barcode sections just repeat over and over again. So we might get a bad result, but let's give it a try and see. Yeah, so here's the problem. We got some fails. Let me show you how to fix that if you're trying to use an image stitching program and you run into this problem. So here in PTGui, we've got this control points section, and this is where you tell it which points on which image match the others. So really all you have to do here is make sure that it's only ever comparing one image with the one right after it in your scan. So I'm going to select number 1. I'm going to select 2 and say control points, generate control points for images 1 and 2. And it didn't find anything. All right, so apparently the nature of these images where they have a lot of kind of soft shapes in them, not a lot of little corners, is making it hard for PTGui to align my images, but never fear. We can work around this by doing it manually. All right, so that was pretty fiddly. It took a while, but I managed to get my images stitched, and now I'm going to export them, and that should show up here in FilmLab. Make it a black and white negative. Oops, it's upside down. There we go. Cool. Here it is. This is what I was aiming for. That is really exciting. It's easier to see the edges if I decrease exposure a little bit. There we go. There's the Eclipse on a strip of film shot on a half-frame camera, just like we drew it up. So that's pretty exciting. There'll be more to do with post-processing that image. I may dodge and burn it a little bit, which in my mind, dodging and burning is totally legitimate, whether you're doing it in the dark room in an analog way or whether you're doing it on a computer. It's literally the same thing. You're just increasing or decreasing exposure on certain parts of the image. So I don't feel like that's, if I decide to dodge and burn this, I don't feel like that's taking away from the authentic analog nature of that image. FilmLab itself does not have dodge and burning tools yet, although that's on our roadmap, but it will in the future. For now, I'll have to use another app like Photoshop if I want to dodge and burn. And I'll show you at the end of this video the finished set of images that came away from this project. But I hope this has been helpful to you. I hope it gives you inspiration to do your own film photography. Think about what you want to shoot. Think about the camera that will help you create the images you want. Plan it, go out and do it, and I look forward to seeing what you come up with.